Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Better Satellite World, the podcast of Space and Satellite Professionals International. I'm Lou Zaccarella. Last week, the city of Winnipeg in the north part of Manitoba, Canada, was named the world's most intelligent community. Among the criteria used was the levels of connectivity and how it was used to grow their local economy. Well, as we continue our discussion about the new public-private partnership and the power of collaboration, we cannot escape a discussion about how satellite connectivity is the underrated technology in this all-important area of our business and our society, or was underrated, maybe I should say. According to a McKinsey report last May, the number of satellites in orbit could exceed 50,000 over the next decade if satellite internet plans come to fruition. Now, those numbers can certainly be disputed, but what isn't disputed is that this would require cutting-edge ground segment infrastructure to effectively function, and much else, including partnerships to help push this connectivity revolution along. So, as we wrap up this series, we're going to speak with an all-star lineup of important Canadians who live and breathe connectivity and collaboration. Stephen Hampton, Mina Mitri, Mark Romoff all join me today on the Better Satellite World. But before you meet them, the series Making Space for Space is brought to you by Artel. Artel, connecting with confidence. The Better Satellite World podcast is also funded in part by the corporate partners of SSPI, Northrop Grumman, EchoStar Hughes, Access Intelligence, and the law firm of K&L Gates. Additional support comes from the 3,000 members of SSPI and its international chapters, including SSPI Canada. Thank you, SSPI. Stephen Hampton is the Manager for Government Affairs and Public Policy at Telesat Canada, one of the world's first, largest, and most successful satellite operators. Its new Lightspeed network may transform global broadband connectivity. Mr. Hampton is responsible for government affairs and public policy at Telesat. Prior to this, he worked at TELUS, focusing on 5G and rural broadband. Stephen received his degree in political science from the University of Ottawa, where it's not snowing yet. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Lou. I really appreciate being here today.
Good to have you. Mina Mitri is the co-founder of Kepler Communications and its CEO. He joins me again. His entrepreneurial skills have been on display for years through his experience conceiving and scaling disruptive and interesting companies. 6 years ago, he founded another one, or co-founded Kepler Communications, whose ultimate mission is bringing internet connectivity to space. Fast Company named Kepler one of the most innovative companies in the world. Mina holds a master's degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Toronto. Hey, Mina, welcome back.
Thanks for having me on the show again, Lou.
It's great to hear your voice. Mark Romoff is a member of the Board of Directors of Infrastructure Ontario and a senior international business strategist who has earned many honors for his contributions to Canada's competitiveness. Mr. Romoff is the former president and CEO of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. He also served his country as a diplomat in several posts. He is the vice chair of the UN's Economic Commission working on public-private partnerships, and he holds his degrees from McGill University, the University of Waterloo, and he is a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government Senior Executives Program. And Mr. Romoff is a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. Welcome, everyone. Okay, before we get into our topic fully, which is the role satellite is committed to play in delivering broadband services to rural citizens and others in Canada, and as I mentioned, connectivity beyond the terrestrial world, let's each of you give me an update on your broadband and LEO ventures, the connectivity ventures that you are each involved with. Stephen, let's start with you. There's a lot of buzz right now about what you guys are doing with Lightspeed. Why don't you, if you don't mind, give us a snapshot of what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lou. So for everyone's benefit, Telesat Lightspeed is a constellation of 298 really advanced satellites that will be able to bring kind of a fiber-like connectivity, enabling 5G connectivity to schools, hospitals, communities, but also planes, ships, government services, et cetera, around the entire world. And Lou, since you and I last spoke, there's been two kind of big updates on the Lightspeed file that are very relevant to today's conversation. Earlier this year in August, we announced a big partnership with the government of Ontario to help connect rural communities across the province, both with connectivity to the community, households, et cetera, but also 5G. And then shortly thereafter, we announced a big partnership with the government of Canada, where they're going to be investing $1.44 billion in Telesat Lightspeed. So not only focusing on digital connectivity across the country, but also focusing on the job creation, the IP development, and all the other benefits that come with that. So following those two announcements, we have financing agreements in place for approximately $4 billion to fund Lightspeed. So we are moving quickly and very excited about where we are.
Yeah, and as I say, that's a big venture. And just for those of you listening in other parts of the world, the province of Ontario, I believe, is the largest or most populated province in Canada, but it has enormous rural communities and distances. Am I about right on that, Stephen?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think if you look at Canada as a whole, and for it's true for most of the provinces, you've got a few big cities where the majority of the population is, but you've got a lot of area where you've got people still living in this space, and that's where we're just not going to get fiber out to a lot of these communities. So
right, and it's been discussed for an awful long time. And
very true. So
we'll get to that and the new ventures that the government has committed itself to. 6 years, Mina, and you're still one of the most closely watched companies in our industry. What's going on at Kepler these days?
Thanks for the kind words, Lou. So, I mean, Kepler's a little bit different than what Telesat is looking to offer here, in that our focus is on bringing communications or internet outside of the surface of the Earth. So we're not providing broadband access to the communities here on Earth, rather to the people, places, and things that all are operating outside of Earth. Right now, we've seen a pretty incredible change in the space sector at large. The way we've known to access space in the past has been entirely redefined. So all sorts of new companies, opportunities, and things are coming up that previously really weren't possible in space. Just a few weeks ago, we saw some pretty great achievements in human space flight with quite a few private companies reaching near orbit or orbit, really cementing, at least in my mind, and I'm sure for many others, that space access as we know it has been fundamentally changed. But the problems we face here on Earth with lack of communications access or internet are far more pronounced outside of Earth. Today, there really doesn't exist an internet service to provision for people, spacecraft, or rockets that are going outside of Earth. And governments are increasingly, whether it's NASA or the European Space Agency, looking for a solution that can provide that communications layer outside of Earth. So I think they play a great role in that collaboration to help us recognize our vision of bringing communications outside of Earth. So in the past little bit, we've raised quite a bit of capital into the business. So now we've got over 100 million in capital in the business working towards the achievement of this vision. We're starting to bring on senior leadership that can help us to further develop this vision. And we're looking up ahead at our next launch of spacecraft to count nearly 19 satellites in operation by January of next year, all in the recognition of the work that we're doing here. And certainly that growth will continue as we continue to deploy and operate our system for the benefit of things, people, and habitats that will all operate in space.
Right. Mina, again, congratulations, because I know you've been building this block by block. Have you guys set a date for the next launch?
So right now it's early January. It's with the launch service provider to kind of finalize those details, but we don't have a fixed date as of yet.
Sure. And just, again, for people who are listening, who, again, are tuning in for a lot of different reasons, why is it important for us to have the kind of connectivity that you described in space rather than have the connectivity be initiated on the ground or go back and forth to the Earth, or however we've always experienced that here as a species?
Yeah, for sure. It's a good question. A lot of assets that move or operate outside of outside of Earth for the benefit of Earth, they move really quick. So they're going North Pole to South Pole roughly in a 90-minute period. And that means at any given window, they're only spending a few minutes over the local geography where they can download information or data. And that's usually the case for things that are taking pictures of the Earth, collecting radar samples, getting weather information, all sorts of applications from these assets that can only download their data roughly 10 minutes out of a 90-minute period that they're orbiting around the Earth. So that means we have poor weather forecasts as a result, missed observations that are, critically important for government and or civilian applications, all of which are stemming from this idea that there's no persistent, always-on internet access outside of Earth. And in the same way, we've seen the entire digital economy be formed here on Earth that's been enabled by the cellular infrastructure and the advances we've seen there. We're looking to see similar advances in space where we put up this infrastructure layer that enables a whole host of new applications and some very current and immediate applications that have a known and pronounced need. If you spend a little bit of time looking at the NASA CSP program, which is a replacement to the TDRS system that's in operation, or the European Space Agency Hydron initiative, both of which are looking for this particular solution.
Yeah, and some interesting science that you guys have going, and maybe I want to circle back with you to talk about, again, collaboration and partnerships for the Kepler venture. So thanks for briefing us and again explaining to us the value proposition. Mark, the government is going to play an enormous role continuously in this, in probably both sectors. Tell us the role of government or Infrastructure Canada's role as these initiatives, the broadband initiative in particular at the moment, rolls out, and connectivity to First Nations and other remote communities that Stephen described is planned and, of course, begins to take shape.
Thanks, Lou, and thanks again for including me in today's session. Maybe it's just a general comment. I think that governments across Canada all recognize that it's really critical to invest in infrastructure, especially now as we're coming out of the pandemic, because we know and we have demonstrated proof that investing in infrastructure really drives jobs, it drives productivity, it really stimulates growth and prosperity, and in the Canadian context, really important, it enables Canada to be globally competitive. At the same time, though, there are some realities, right? There's an infrastructure deficit across the country. There is a fiscal challenge being confronted by many governments. But at the same time, the citizens like you and me want infrastructure built faster, cheaper, and better. And that's really been the rationale behind introducing public-private partnerships as a vehicle to procure infrastructure across Canada. And it has been widely adopted. In fact, today we have more than 300 public-private partnerships. And the organization that I led up until a short while ago, the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships, is unique in that the organization collaborates with all levels of government and Indigenous communities and the private sector in order to enable the very best outcomes from these investments in sustainable infrastructure. And the bottom line, of course, is enhancing the quality of life of Canadians. So it's not surprising that governments are making these large investments. First and foremost, the federal government, the one that you've referred to. And as you may be aware, that Infrastructure Canada, the federal government department responsible for this portfolio, did initiate an Investing in Canada infrastructure program several years back, which began with an investment of $186 billion in infrastructure. And again, for all the right reasons, but one of the most important reasons was to improve broadband connectivity. And what's really, I think, interesting, and I know that Nina and Stephen are very involved in this, that more recently, Canada did introduce a connectivity strategy, which is aimed at connecting all Canadians to affordable high-speed internet, no matter where they live.
Right.
The objective is for 100% of Canadian households to have internet access at the 50 megabits per second speed by 2030. And the government is helping to fund these solutions across the country, whether they're wireless, terrestrial, or satellite-based, to ensure that unserved or underserved rural and remote communities are connected. You made reference earlier to the fact that we're a large country and there are still pockets that are underserved. The reality is that we're the second largest country in the world in terms of geography, but
Right.
we only have 35 million people. So, in some parts of the country, you might not meet your neighbor for some time.
Right.
It's particularly the case in the north.
Or he's in Montana somewhere.
There you go. So there are challenges, but the connectivity strategy is really important because, as you can appreciate, all the communities, both urban and rural, rely on access to reliable and affordable high-speed internet and mobile connectivity. We needn't tell you that it's essential for personal and professional communications, to grow a business, to apply for jobs, to do your homework, and to access government services. And maybe for me, what's also so important is that Canada is very focused on trying to attract the best talent from around the world.
Right.
And unless we've got high quality connectivity, that we won't be a country of choice. So all these elements are in play as backdrop to introduce the connectivity strategy. We can come back to this later, but the federal government is very active. The Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is a federal crown corporation that has a mandate to invest with other partners in enabling new infrastructure to come to market, is very focused on broadband and notably on enabling connectivity for Indigenous communities across the country. And of course, the province of Ontario. I think Mina or Stephen made reference to their program a few minutes ago. That's Infrastructure Ontario. I serve on that board, which is leading the agenda. And another thing we might come back to later on is the Smart Cities competition that the Government of Canada ran a few years back. And I was privileged to be invited to chair that initiative. And again, that's all about enabling a smart cities approach for cities across the country by focusing on innovation, data, and connected technology. So there's lots happening by all levels of government across Canada, and it's important to see that it's been recognized as a priority and that broadband connectivity is at the heart of much of what is on the top of the priority list for governments here.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's well said. And you really did put up a couple of key points here, which we'll unpack. Certainly the one about keeping talent home. 35 million people, a very highly educated population, a lot of innovators like Mina Mitri up there doing some really, really interesting stuff. You do want to keep them home because, we'd take them down here in a second.
Yeah.
Be like a baseball team, like the Yankees rating, somebody's talent, right? You don't want that to happen. So you want to keep the talent there. So you want to make sure, as you said, that you don't have infrastructure deficits, which I think is, a very, very good way of saying it. And of course, you need to punch above your weight, right? I mean, you're sitting next to this enormous economy, where I'm sitting right now, and you need to be competitive in the world. It's just fundamental to Canada's continued prosperity. Now, the goal is, as you laid it out, is to deliver 100% of broadband nationwide by 2030. It seems doable in a nation of under 40 million. But Stephen, let's talk about the reality. What are the challenges delivering this and fulfilling the mission, which the government, I think, has put a stake in Telesat to do as well?
For sure, and it's funny. I echo so much of what Mark just said, but one of the things that he touched on was, you need a toolkit. It's not one size fits all for everything. So in some areas you're going to need fiber, in some areas you're going to need terrestrial wireless, in some areas you're going to need satellite systems. And I think if you look at Canada, and I give a lot of credit to the government of Canada, Ontario, Quebec, and others across the country, and we're seeing this around the world, but they're really kind of embracing this multi-tool solution where they are leveraging fiber where it makes sense, where they're leveraging, Telesat Lightspeed in Canada's case where it makes sense. Because the reality is we just can't have one technology do all of it.
Right.
When I think of what the biggest challenge is, it's affordable backhaul. And for those outside of the telecom space, backhaul is the big superhighway pipe that goes from an urban area and brings the internet to a small community. And the challenge is that if you've got a small community of a couple hundred households that is 200 kilometers away from an existing fiber, like getting the internet to that community is the biggest challenge. So I think the government has rightly prioritized, let's address this backhaul challenge and let's leverage the different technologies to bring affordable, dynamic, resilient, reliable backhaul into these communities. And then in the community, Telesat, certainly from our experience, and Mark also touched on this about working with local governments, provincial governments, Indigenous communities, but we'll partner with an Indigenous community, for example, and they'll deliver the last mile connectivity. So that's the actual connectivity to the schools, hospitals, households, et cetera. And Telesat will bring in that big, affordable, dynamic backhaul pipe into the community. So when I think of what the biggest challenge is, it's that it is solving the backhaul issue. So when I think of 98% of the country connected by 2026, yeah, I think that's absolutely doable. And I feel, and speaking on behalf of Telesat, we're pretty humbled and honored that we're going to play an important role in that.
Yeah, and of course, satellite is really good for backhaul. I mean, it's been an application
exactly
for forever, right? Since you and I have been in this business. And of course, as we see more cloud based applications and economic activity, it does give those smaller communities a much more competitive advantage if you can get the connectivity out there. But Stephen, what are the challenges right now? Are they technical challenges? Are they political challenges? I mean, you work on both sides of the street. Are they cultural challenges? What are you guys looking at as the next problem to be solved in this, I think, admirable mission to connect every Canadian?
Absolutely. I think there's been a lot of progress made over the last several years. I think from a funding perspective and the role that governments have to play. Mark highlighted this earlier about governments recognize that they have a massive role to play in this. And we're seeing this around the world where governments are playing a big role in funding, in kind of helping convene their championing kind of nation building initiatives. So I think that's one, is that the government and the funding and this kind of public-private partnership model is really being adopted. On the technical side, I think there's been some massive technological leaps over the last kind of decade or so. I think Mina talked about it at the beginning, but the access to space has never been more affordable and more relevant. So we've seen access to space is much more affordable. We're seeing big leaps in technologies like onboard processing and optical optical satellite connectivity, and kind of the AI and machine learning that makes all of this work. So from a technological standpoint, we've made some massive leaps. And then I think there's other ones from kind of the demand for broadband is growing exponentially. The OECD kind of pegs it at it's doubling every 3 years for IP demand. So we're seeing that the demand and that total addressable market meet and kind of facilitate these very large capital intensive projects.
Right.
And I think from a regulatory,
yeah,
exactly. And then I think the last one is always a regulatory perspective. I mean, if you're doing a global constellation, you need regulatory approval across all of these countries. And I think what we're seeing is governments around the world are very kind of quickly recognizing the value of space when it comes to connectivity and working to ensure that that they can leverage that. So I think there are challenges, but I do think we're in a really good place, kind of for Telesat, but also just writ large. I think we're in a really good place as we move forward with this.
Yeah, thanks, Mina. Speaking now just as a Canadian business person, as you two questions for you. As you look at this initiative that Mark and Stephen have been talking about, how do you view the collaboration between private sector carriers and government? And then secondly, maybe we can connect some dots here between your connectivity proposition for space, the space community in space, versus something on the ground. Does this enable that at all? Does it make it easier to do it from Canada?
So maybe I'll answer your questions in reverse order.
Okay.
So trying to think through, how does my connectivity proposition in space apply to the Canadians and the work that we're doing here? Oftentimes the best and most capable technical solutions we've found have not been by solving direct problems here on Earth. When we've had to solve for the issue of how do we make astronauts survive and how do we deal with medicine outside of Earth, that's yielded considerable advancement in rural healthcare here, even in Canada, and quite a few inventions that I won't name. But, when I think through the work that we're doing in bringing telecommunications access outside of Earth, the challenges we face and the developments we have to undertake will have outsized benefits back to Canadians as we start to bring on board key technologies that are in harsher climates, harsher conditions, that'll benefit all sorts of programs and activities. For us, that it's similar to what Stephen had highlighted, some of the advancements in optical intersatellite communications, some of the advancements in onboard processing that make this all possible and routed. Those types of advancements are far harder for us to conclude in an environment like space, that we can bring back those particular technologies in support of work that's happening to communicate with Canadians here on Earth.
Right.
And in fact, if we believe in the future that space access in of itself has been redefined and regulations and transportation and habitation are becoming solved problems, then there'll be a view that we as citizens will eventually go out and habitat space and take advantage of it, starting with private space tourism as the initial advancement, so benefiting those that will do private space flights. But then as we expand beyond that into the Lunar Initiative and have more semi-permanent habitats outside of Earth, we'll certainly take advantage of those.
Mm-hmm. And the first part of that question, again, is you just view this as a Canadian and someone who is in business and understands the broadband deficits that may or may not exist, and the issues that Mark was talking about earlier about retaining talent and incubating talent and making sure you've got the proper infrastructure to continue to generate the next generation of Mina Mitris. Honestly, how do you see it? Is it moving fast enough? Is it adequate? Are there other best practices that Canada should be looking at right now?
Yeah, certainly. And so Mark had already touched on this idea that making sure we've got the right infrastructure to support those early stage entrepreneurs so that Canada is a first choice destination. So I certainly won't repeat those points, but I'd focus in on the area where we want to have exciting and impactful problems that help to attract very interesting talent to Canada. A recent example of that was we'd brought on board our Chief Operations Officer, Stephen Bennett, who was responsible for the New Shepard program that recently took Jeff Bezos up into space. And being able to bring that caliber of talent into Canada is really driven by the impact statement and the benefit that they seek from the work that they get to do day in, day out. So collaboration with government would be to help in those early stages to take those larger swings towards impactful work. And we've been the beneficiary of some of those collaborations to help attract that particular talent. Yeah.
And again, if anybody goes to Canada, and I mentioned Winnipeg earlier, which I actually like very much, Hamilton, which I think is a transformed city in many ways. You'll see even the small and mid-sized cities really, I think, preparing themselves for the kind of future that we're talking about with smart cities, as one of you mentioned earlier on. I think it was Mark. Okay, thanks, Mina. Mark and Stephen. Mark, why don't you go first? How much of the funding and government focus is on that all-important ground segment? Because, my friends in the teleport industry, and the antenna industry and the high power amplifier industry say to me, boy, great stuff going on in the sky. But if they don't think about us guys on the ground, or if we don't innovate, none of this communication and connectivity is going to happen the way we're envisioning it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think from the federal government perspective, again, when we come back to Canada's connectivity strategy, they're very focused on making investments across the full spectrum, if you like, of players, whether it's ground or terrestrial. I mean, I would defer to both Mina and Stephen in terms of whether they share that view, but I know that at the federal government level, they are trying to think big and deliver big. Sorry, that seems a little trite, but I truly believe that. But the key in the end are partnerships. So governments interested, they have the wherewithal to do it. As you know, we have a new government now, new ministers. They'll all be committed to driving this agenda ahead. But what's really critical are the partnerships and the continuing engagement with the private sector. Because in the end, it's folks like Mina that are really going to drive the next generation of technology and make a difference. And I think governments recognize their area of expertise and where they can make a difference and be helpful. But it's going to be the private sector and entrepreneurs and, quite frankly, academics that are developing sort of next generation technologies on the bench at colleges and universities across the country and helping get those technologies commercialized. I was honored in a previous life to have headed up the Ontario Centres of Excellence, and that was exactly the mandate. It was to connect academics who had an ambition to become entrepreneurs, connect them with the private sector, enable them to get their technologies commercialized, or provide them with the funding they needed to take their ideas to market themselves and create those companies like Kepler, which are really what's going to drive the next iteration, in my view.
Yeah. So obviously the government sees its role as enabling economic growth in the private sector. Stephen, you obviously Telesat doesn't need a heck of a lot of help from the government. I mean, it's, Dan Goldberg runs a pretty good company up there. Fellow New Yorker, by the way, I should add, shout out to Dan. But is some of the funding that you're getting being dedicated to the what they call the ground segment, to making sure that the facilities on the ground, the networks on the ground are capable of managing, again, the different bands that are going to be used, the different type of communication that's going to be required for a low Earth orbit versus the geosynchronous orbit, that kind of thing? For
sure. And I think it's important. I find with the satellite space, Lou, to your point, the ground segment is equally important. And at Telesat, we're doing a lot in this space and working with a lot of really world-leading companies on the ground segment. And I would say that from a government perspective, there's a couple ways that there's the R&D aspect of working with these companies and these innovators and driving innovation and investment into the ground segment to push the barrier as far as what's the art of the possible, making antennas smaller and more powerful, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And then there's just the practical side of making sure that we're actually connecting people. And I know in Canada, for example, the government really looks at connectivity as and I say Canada, but really it's around the world. Governments look at connectivity in a pretty holistic way, and they're not looking at it in a vacuum of, oh, if we just have the terrestrial stuff, that's fine. If we just have the space segment, that's fine. They really are looking at it in a much more kind of holistic way, where it's, let's make sure that when we partner with the Telesat, we're also partnering with the right companies to ensure that the ground equipment is there in these communities, and that it's done in a way where you're driving kind of the most efficient, affordable, best outcome for communities. So I would say the ground segment can't get lost in the conversation, and I think for the most part, governments around the world recognize that.
Yeah, of course, the challenge you had mentioned, Blue Origin, which of course is going to have their own fleet. Starlink now, SpaceX is fleet is up there. Broadband services are also being delivered. But the reality of that right now is that the antennas, the cost of some of the ground segment stuff is still quite high and has to be subsidized. In SpaceX's case, Elon Musk reaches into his own pocket, right, to subsidize the cost of the antennas, the flat panels. Do you? And this is speculative. Well, no, it's not actually. It's a good straight question. Do you think it's government's role to help subsidize that antenna system until the technology catches up and it can be produced in a more cost-effective way and integrated across the system, or should the private sector go it alone? And quickly, Stephen and Mark,
Yeah, I'll be really quick on that. I think that it's important to note that there's kind of the model, the direct-to-consumer model that a Starlink, for example, has taken, where to your point, you buy an antenna in Canada. I think it's just shy of $1,000, and then it goes right on the individual's household. Telesat does a little bit of a different approach. We work with a local ISP or MNO, and then we'll have one antenna. We call it a community aggregator model, but where basically we'll have an antenna in the community where we'll bring all the traffic down to that one point, and then the ISP or MNO will connect communities via wireless or fiber, et cetera. So it's a slightly different model. What I would say as far as the government's role in this is, there are certain communities where I would say Canada's done a pretty good job of connectivity, but there's a lot of communities where there's just no business case for it. It is a market failure where we're not at 100% connectivity. And that's where, governments do have roles to come in and in certain circumstances, support with things like the ground infrastructure. So I think there's a time and a place for it. And I think in a lot of communities, it is the best solution forward. And I think, it goes to the earlier comment that kind of everyone here has made about broadband really is the enabler of everything, whether it's keeping talent, whether it's innovating, whether it's kind of, productivity, growth, innovation, et cetera. Without broadband, you don't have it. So when we think of really base, core, super important infrastructure, broadband's at the top of the list. So in some instances,
Absolutely.
I think it makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Actually, I wrote a book in 2008 called Broadband Economy. So I'm looking really smart now to people, for a change. My relatives say, he might know something anyway. Mark, just quickly on that point though, you've been around the world, you've seen a lot of different models. It's the proper role for government to subsidize certain elements of the new broadband network, the new railroad when proper?
Well, I think Stephen's right that, and we made reference to this earlier, Canada's a big country, and just by that reality, there are lots of very small communities, underserved communities where there is no business case. But the reality is that there's a very strong social and quality of life case to be made. And I think that's where government can make a huge difference and is keenly interested in stepping in to move the yardsticks. So I think recognizing where there's a role and a need that needs to be filled by government, that's where government should step in. And where the private sector is better positioned to make the difference, let them take the lead. And again, all of this really is dependent upon the nature of that relationship, that partnership, that commitment to collaboration between public and private sectors across the country. And I think if we can get that equation right, we will really make enormous headway.
Right. Okay. And so you're going to Mina gets $1 billion after this conversation, right?
I have no control.
Certainly what I heard.
Well, I apologize to Mina and to you, Lou, but I have no influence over the way in which the government of Canada allocates its funding.
Right.
Of course. Make the case, Mina. I think you'll be well received.
There you go.
Mark,
hey,
I'll give you a shout later so that you can be on my side.
SSPI, we're all about networking. Yeah.
Got it.
Hey, listen, Mark, I want to stay with you because you mentioned something earlier, and I do want to get into the PPPs, the new PPPs, partnerships. You'd mentioned, I think the council has 300 public-private partnerships. The number 300 was thrown out there. Do I
Yeah.
have that right? Yeah.
Yes, you do.
Okay.
And this is across a whole range of sectors, right?
Okay.
It's not obviously just broadband. So it's principally in the transit sector and in the hospitals and healthcare arena. So of that 300, almost 100 of them are hospitals and long-term care facilities that have been built across the country using the public-private partnership model.
Got it. My question when I heard it was, is there a template for a public-private partnership that might be evolving as we begin to put together, Canada's broadband goal? Is there one that you say, I start with this premise, having done this for a long, long time and very, very successfully, and then you build on it and perhaps you've innovated recently?
There are templates for public-private partnerships. There's no doubt about that. I'd make a couple of comments, though. Even the concept of public-private partnerships is itself evolving. And so what we're seeing is that in Canada, governments are obviously investing in public infrastructure, and they're trying to get as innovative and creative as they possibly can. I think we're going to see this happening in the broadband arena, particularly in Ontario, because Infrastructure Ontario has recently developed a new and sort of innovative procurement approach, which they view as fair and a transparent process, which aims to help connect underserved and unserved communities, and obviously to expand high-speed internet access. Again, I'll be interested in the views of both Mina and Stephen and their knowledge of this initiative. It is relatively new. But as I understand it, these unserved or underserved communities are being organized into geographic areas, and a competitive bidding process is being put in place, which will enable ISPs to bid for opportunities to provide high-speed internet access to these communities across the province. So there are new and innovative models now being introduced. And I know that in the case of Infrastructure Ontario, they are engaging actively with the business community in order to ensure that as they develop these new approaches, they respond to any of the concerns that the private sector may have, because models are one thing, but if the private sector isn't engaged or interested in bidding these opportunities, then they're going to be at a standstill. So it is an interesting time in that sense in Ontario, and they of course account for so much of the investment in Canada, but other parts of the country, other provinces, and particularly the territories in the north, are watching carefully and looking to adapt and adopt different approaches in order to get the very best return on their respective investments.
Mina, do you want to pick up on that? Because I believe Mark said he was interested in how you might view that, and then I've got another follow-up question for you.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think it's comparable, if I'm understanding it right, to the RDOF done in the US, where they had a similar situation, a reverse bid where operators could go in and bid on regions of interest at the best price, winning. Certainly that is has advantages, but there are also some disadvantages associated with that approach, in that it favors well-capitalized infrastructure operations, and a greater capital expenditure spend helps you in advancing into some of those opportunities. So the other way we've seen a benefit from those large types of awards to small, medium-sized businesses has been through the contribution of offsets or some form of commitment to reinvest back into the Canadian ecosystem. And that kind of is a way to mitigate for some of the downsides we've seen.
Stephen, do you want to comment on that? And then I'm going to circle back with Mina because I've got a question for him.
Yeah, and as Mina's right, the Ontario one is very similar to the RDOF auction that was done by the FCC. late last year, I believe. I think I would just make the point is that if we look across the country and around the world, governments are backing broadband in a big way. You've got the government of Quebec, who has thrown serious money behind this to get universal connectivity by end of next year. You've got Ontario, who has put very large sums of money behind this, and they're trying different ways. They've got a partnership with us. They've done other fiber projects. Now they're doing this auction, so they're looking at different ways of doing this. But Canada, same thing. BC and other provinces, same thing. Governments recognize this, and they're getting involved in a big way, and they're being bold and ambitious, and that's what we need.
Yeah. Mina, I'm going to take you back to your business model again. Mark could, and Stephen, can refer to some best practices in public-private partnerships and in building the kinds of collaboration necessary to get this job done. There probably weren't many best practices for you to look at, but having said that, there must be partnerships that you've entered into. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. I think for us, the university institutions across Canada have been a pretty instrumental part of our business. A lot of the early technical validation, early de-risking that we were able to do was driven by some of those institutions, and we've partnered with them through and through. And even to this date, we've got partners all across the universities that continue to help us feed our talent pool. And we've now started in a few different partnership opportunities that reach internationally, where the government has some bridging resources that allow you to engage with partners across Europe and other areas so that you can do similar types of work. So that's where we've really seen some of the partnership opportunities play out and really help us to advance the state of the development here.
Do you see more activity required from the R&D, the academic community, again, given the complex nature of what you're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I think there'll be two aspects of partnerships we continue to seek, and ones that we will look for net new. So there's certainly the aspect of partnership around continued development because of the fair complexity that we introduce into our network and the types of challenges that we have to solve outside of Earth. And so we need the best and brightest minds to help us make that impact. And at the same time, I think there's going to be, at this point in time, an increasing importance to lean on the Canadian government for later stage partnerships. So we are, for all intents and purposes, building a large and complex capital infrastructure project. And in these later stages of development, we do sort of look towards the export agencies, the debt financiers, the infrastructure banks that can help us to create a reasonable return for our shareholders by affording us capital at lower rates being borrowed than we traditionally would have access to. And that's where we'll be looking to seek new partnership with the Canadian government and other governments across the world.
Yeah, and it's a pretty good pathway to go. Okay, we're running out of time here. This has been a great conversation, but I did want to circle back on one subject. Winnipeg, as I mentioned, was just named the Intelligent Community of the Year, and it's located in a relatively remote part of North America, but it's a big city, great hockey team, or good hockey team. Would you envision, Mark, that rural populations around cities like Winnipeg, I mentioned a couple of others earlier, I think Hamilton, but others that are a little bit more remote, maybe out in Saskatchewan and those places, will see a growth as a result of this ubiquitous connectivity with broadband? And does Infrastructure Canada sort of have an economic model or a visioning notion of what that might look like?
That's a great question. I tend to be a huge optimist when it comes to this particular point. And I think it's obviously driven by the fact that I was honored to play a valued role in Canada's Smart Cities competition. And what impressed me is that particular initiative was pan-Canadian and open to all municipalities, local and regional governments, and Indigenous communities, um, large and small. And what's amazing is that, as you may know, there was $75 million made available for this initiative, and there were 4 communities in the end that received a portion of that money.
Right.
But what's most important is that while you might think that cities would be trying to drive a smart cities agenda to really drive economic output, so much of the focus was on social issues and how to use data and connected technology to address very tough issues in communities. So I'm very optimistic about the possibility of communities of all sizes around the country to really benefit from data and connected technology to drive the kinds of improvements in the quality of their citizens' lives
Yes.
that's offered here. And broadband is sort of one prism to look at this through, but it's more than that. And so, as I say, I'm really very optimistic about the opportunity here and how to use connectivity to drive real advances and address issues like energy poverty, mental health issues that communities are trying to address, and new circular, business opportunities and collaboration. So the opportunity is vast, and without being naive about this, I think it's only really limited by our imagination, which is why I love listening to people like Nina and Stephen, because they're big thinkers, and I've learned a lot just listening to them over the course of this podcast. So thank you both for that.
Well, that's why we have all 3 of you guys here, so I can do that. But you're absolutely right, Mark. It's a tool, and it's a tool to build cultures that are stronger. And it's cultural first. It's not the technology first. And I think sometimes we get that wrong. But Canadians generally don't get it wrong. And I should add, my friend John Young at the Intelligent Community Forum would love what you just said. He's probably sitting there in Toronto and listening to this. It is absolutely spot on. We're out of time. Just a yes or no question. Many years ago, Madam Suvi Linden, the communications director of Finland, went to her parliament and said, we're going to declare broadband a human right. We're going to take it out of the level of a technology discussion or even an infrastructure discussion, and we're going to declare it a right of all men and women. Yes or no? Stephen, good idea?
Yeah, I think so. I think when you look at the importance of broadband, I think so.
Okay. Mina?
Without a doubt, it creates an incredible amount of economic activity and advantages everybody equally.
Okay. And I'm going to guess what Mark's going to say, but Mark?
Absolutely, yes. I am there 100%.
Right. I knew we'd get the short yes answer from Mark. All right, but we've got a yes from all you guys. Well, listen, it's always a pleasure, Mina and Stephen, speaking with you. Mark, it's been great to get to know you here. I know you don't have a lot of time during your busy day, so I really appreciate you coming by to speak with us here.
Thank you very much, Lou. And thanks for moderating the discussion, right? It's often not recognized. It's an important role, and without you, we'd all just be all over the place.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lou, for having us. Really enjoyed the conversation, and Mina, Mark, really great to meet you both.
And that wraps up our conversation with Stephen Hampton, Mina Mitri, and Mark Romoff. For more information on Telesat, go to telesat.com/connect-everyone. For Kepler, go to kepler.space. And to learn more about Infrastructure Canada's programs, go to infrastructure.gc.ca. I'd like to hear your thoughts about this series, so send your comments to me as well at lzaccarella@sspi.org. SSPI is the voice of the space and satellite professional, a professional whose work makes the world a better place every single minute of the day. To learn more about our Better Satellite World campaign and to see how brands like our sponsor Artel benefit from it, go to bettersatelliteworld.com. For more information on the sponsor of this series, Artel, visit artelllc.com. For 30 years, Artel has provided secure network communication services to agencies of the USA's federal government. Hey, if you're not a member of SSPI, I'd like to remind you, go to sspi.org. Dues are $100 a year, and student memberships are free. You'll really enjoy the experience because guys like this are all around SSPI. Later this week on November 17th, join SSPI and the New York Space Business Roundtable as it continues its series on ESG and its impact on the commercial space industry. On the 17th of November, the provocative Richard Morrison of the Competitive Enterprise Institute and investment banker Douglas Jarrell of Barclays Capital join Jason Rainbow of Space News and others to discuss social factors of the space economy. You really won't want to miss that. To register at no cost, go to sspi.org and click on the events page. Please follow us on Twitter at SSPI and check us out on LinkedIn and Facebook. For Space and Satellite Professionals International and our producer, Ana Gomez, I'm Lou Zaccarella. Let's make it a better satellite world. Take care, everybody.